Okay, Professor Gerald Horne from the History Department of Houston University. Thank you for joining us here at Important Cool. We're now live on YouTube, and this video will be up for everyone to see in perpetuity as a sort of backup for any quotes I use from you in the article I'm writing about the Black Lives Matter issue. Of course, I'm coming from an outside perspective outside the United States. I'm from Australia, and I'm living in Quito, which is, probably moving in politically the opposite direction of the United States. It's a more increasingly inclusive and prosperous place. Actually, it's interesting that the urban poverty rates have been dropping here and rising in the United States till they're almost about equal. So for someone from outside the United States who's got a very limited understanding of the internal dynamics of U.S. society, what's going on here?
Well, first of all, with regard to Ecuador, I should mention that a book I wrote on the U.S. role in the slave trade to Brazil, I mentioned that during the U.S. Civil War, when the plight of the population of African descent in North America was up for grabs, there was a plan to try to deport all the U.S. Negroes to Ecuador. But for various reasons, it didn't work out. As I sit here in North America, sometimes I wonder if that would have been a better idea. But in any case, with regard to what's going on,
right now, I would say quite possibly.
Say that again?
I was saying right now, I would say quite possibly. There's, the extension of healthcare and schooling and all these things. Ecuador is, starting from a very low base, but moving in the exact opposite direction of North America and European countries at the moment.
But with regard to what's going on here, please allow me, first of all, to go on a slight historical excursion. I don't think you can understand the United States today without understanding how it was founded. In a book I recently published, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, what I argue there is that rather than being some sort of grand revolt and a step forward for humanity, the reason that slaveholders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all the rest revolted against British rule in 1776 was because Britain was moving towards the abolition of slavery and was envisioning a different role for the population of African descent. And rather than go along with the abolition of slavery, the slave owners revolted. In that sense, the United States should be analogized, for example, to Rhodesia, which in November 1965, in the nation now known as Zimbabwe, you had a so-called white minority government that rebelled against Britain rather than capitulate to the idea of one person, one vote, or African majority rule. Therefore, given the United States and the fact that the Africans in North America did not largely join this revolt against British rule, a culture was created that sees the African population of North America as being perpetual dissidents, as being perpetual enemies of the state. In fact, the slave patrols that were inaugurated in the United States after the formation of this country, in many ways, they formed the foundation of urban police departments in southern cities like Atlanta and Charleston and Savannah, etc. In other words, just like during the days of the slave patrol, a Black person seen out and about was subject to being questioned, interrogated, or worse, if they did not have some sort of proper explanation as to why they were walking through a certain neighborhood. That kind of system, to a large extent, still exists today. It's one of the reasons why when a dark-skinned person like myself goes into a department store, I'm usually followed around. It's one of the reasons why Black preschoolers, we're talking about kids who are 4 years old, are suspended at a higher rate from preschool than any other group. That's one of the reasons why the United States is the incarceration king of the world, with a disproportionate percentage of the prisoners being of African descent. That's why on death row, those slated to be executed by the state, a disproportionate percentage of those slated to be executed by the state are of African descent. I could go on with this litany in terms of high infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy, and all of the rest. But I think you get the picture, particularly with regard to Baltimore, That is to say, Baltimore represents a prototypical incident, I'm afraid. Just as in Ferguson, Missouri, in August 2014, you had a very similar incident when Michael Brown was shot down by the police. Or you can go to YouTube and watch the shooting down of Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, by the police authorities, with the police concocting a tale, the typical tale about how he was supposedly not complying with their reasonable requests, and therefore they had to shoot him. But you can see that he was running away from the cops, and they shot him in the back. That's why Tamir Rice in Cleveland was shot down. You can probably find that on YouTube too. So
there's just an incident in Baltimore. There was an incident in Baltimore yesterday where someone at a protest, people from the protest movement are saying he was shot by police who were chasing him. I think the official police story now is that he shot himself in the back somehow. Unfortunately, the incident wasn't on video camera, so we don't know if that, freakish incident that they're depicting, that crazy story of theirs is actually true. Stranger things have happened, but not very often. We don't know if that's true. So the importance of video evidence is obviously clear, and this is starting to surface because people have camera phones. But one of the questions I want to ask you is: there's been this spate of high-profile incidents recently. Is that just a rise in visibility of an ongoing problem, or is there an increase in police brutality?
I would say there's an increase, and I would also say there is a rise in visibility. Let's step back into history for a second. The United States, I should say in all fairness, when it was founded in the late 18th century, did represent a step forward from the religious conflict that had been rocking Europe, Protestant versus Catholic in Britain, Christians versus Jewish, and then Christians versus Muslims. But the United States replaced that religious axis with a racial axis. That is to say, those who are defined as white versus those not defined as white. Are you still with me?
I am. I'm sorry. I've turned off my camera because I wanted to, the connection was getting a little bit stressed. I wanted to give as much bandwidth as I could to your side. Okay,
fine. So in other words, those defined as white versus those not defined as white. That's the new divergence from the United States, which is one of the reasons in my book I call it the first apartheid society. That apartheid society begins to retreat in the 20th century, not least because of the rise of the class project, particularly the organizing of unions, since Black people are disproportionately working class, actually disproportionately proletarians, that is to say, working in transport or factories or on the docks, etc. And with the rise of unions being assisted by union movements abroad and also assisted by socialist projects abroad, this led to a retreat of the apartheid society. But we all know that globally and domestically, the class project has suffered debilitating blows in recent decades. And it's no accident in my mind that as the class project has retreated domestically and globally, you've seen a recrudescence of religious conflict, as we see with the rise of ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. But we also see the recrudescence of racism, but not least in North America, because the class project had operated as something of a restraint on the US ruling elite and on US society as a whole. So therefore, I argue that now you're seeing a resurgence because of the decline of the class project and a return of the United States to its origins and to its roots.
It's interesting you mentioned, religious, the religious axis of discrimination. Clearly, that's coming back with so much anti-Muslim feeling being sort of pumped up in the United States as well, and an increase in racism. And you see both of these as a result of the sort of the left's retreat, the failure of the failure of the class project to impose itself on the establishment. I just want to go back to your original point for a little bit, because just to re-encapsulate that, as a foreigner, as someone from outside the United States, I've always been sold this story of America's great quest for liberty and this essentially progressive project, again, on which slavery was this great stain, this horrible aberration. But you're inverting that and saying, no, the freedom that they're talking about is the freedom to be racist, is the freedom to own slaves. Racism is at the core of the American state. And you're also saying that not just at the federal level, these state militias went on to become the police forces that now exist. The state is itself a fundamentally racist project. Is it redeemable?
Well, it depends on what you mean by redeemable. I think obviously radical surgery is called for. And unless radical surgery takes place, I'm afraid we're always going to have the snuff film of the week. You know, some poor black person being shot down by the police and then uploaded to YouTube. So it depends on what you mean by redeemable. Even absent radical surgery, I think that there are certain reforms that can take place that could be positive and a step forward. For example, police training in this country is very short and not too extensive. And also they have this idea of zero tolerance for example, marijuana smoking. It's incredible how many black people have been jailed for smoking one marijuana cigarette, for example. So those kinds of reforms would be very useful. But ultimately, I think we need radical surgery in this country. We need, for example, what I've just imparted to you and your audience concerning the history of the United States, it needs to be part of the classrooms. Now, obviously, that's an uphill climb. That's a steep climb because the creation myth of the United States and its origins is heavily dependent upon the alleged angelic nature of the founders. And it's going to be very difficult to convince millions of people otherwise.
This is interesting. It's something that my last interviewee said. She's an activist from Kentucky. And she says that, you know, outside of Black History Month, you never hear anything about race relations in US history, and that's one of the key areas they're fighting in to get that introduced to local school curriculums and so forth. But moving, we've only got a short time, so I want to cover a lot of ground with you quite quickly. I mean, what's we were talking about the sort of fundamental racism of the United States as a historical project. Of course, that relates also to the genocide of Native Americans, and I would say beyond that to American militarism overseas. There's a narrative you can make that these eastern states started pushing violently westwards and just never stopped. Once they hit the coast, they went to the Philippines, and from the Philippines to Vietnam and so forth. What relationship does the sort of imperial project have with racism and oppression at home?
That's an excellent question, and that's the kind of questions we need asked more in our classrooms. The foreign policy of a state is usually an extension of the domestic policy. And as you state correctly, the United States was founded upon dispossession of the indigenous population. And not only dispossession of the indigenous population, but particularly in the 17th century, enslaving the indigenous population, particularly sending the indigenous, say, of Connecticut to Barbados, for example, and then sending some of the indigenous people in the Caribbean to the North American mainland, and then bringing Africans from particularly West Africa to work in the fields. And then after the Native American population was pummeled and pulverized, particularly by the 1890s, you see an extension of that domestic project, first of all, to Hawaii in the 1890s with the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, a subject I talk about in my book, The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas after the U.S. Civil War, which, by the way, has a lot of history of Australia in that text, because what happens is that these U.S. slave owners, after being defeated in the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, they pack their bags and move to the South Seas, where they begin trying to enslave the indigenous population of Hawaii and of Fiji, and also taking these indigenous populations to plantations in Queensland, Australia, and also to plantations in Fiji and other islands of the South Seas. And then from there, as you correctly note, moving on to denude the tottering Spanish Empire of the Philippines, and at the same time denuding the tottering Spanish Empire of Cuba and Puerto Rico. And from there, standing aside during World War I, watching the European powers bloody and pummel themselves into submission before finally entering that war. Interestingly enough, after revolutionary upsurge in Russia, and there was a fear that unless the United States intervened, that the revolutionary project in Russia would proceed more speedily than it did. And of course, with the United States intervening against Germany, that put paid to the pretensions of Berlin to oust Britain as being the leading European power, and the war was concluded in November 1918. But what happens from there is that the United States collaborates with the European powers in trying to squash the Bolshevik Revolution, and then, of course, collaborating with the European powers virtually up until the United States is bombed by Japan on December 7th, 1941, and has to enter World War II on the side of Moscow. That, of course, is a turning point in terms of U.S. domestic politics, because what it does is that once the United States enters World War II on the side of Moscow, it helps to make illegitimate the anti-communism that had been the major ideological bulwark of the right. And then you begin to see the retreat of apartheid. That's what I mean about the impact of the class project on U.S. domestic politics. That retreat of apartheid accelerates after the end of World War II, but at the same time, what happens is that the U.S. ruling class makes a decision to, on the one hand, retreat from apartheid, but on the other hand, batter radicalism into the ground. There it is to say that once the United States exits World War II, it lusts for world domination. Therefore, you have the Cold War. Therefore, you have the war in Korea, 1950 to 1953, which involves credible allegations of germ and biological warfare by the U.S. authorities. Then you have the United States replacing France after France is ousted from Vietnam after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and ultimately sending tens of thousands of troops to Vietnam before being expelled on April 30th, 1975, the anniversary, of course, just being marked, but not drawing the appropriate lessons from the Vietnam War, and instead trying to extend its imperial project to what we refer to as the Middle East, that is to say the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, and of course I've neglected to mention the invasion of Grenada in 1983. I neglected to mention the overthrow of the regime in Panama in the late 1980s. I mean, the list is endless.
It goes on. I mean, just in recent years, there was an attack here inside Ecuador. There was, Colombian forces clearly working closely with U.S. military experts because they wouldn't have had the capacity to pull off this particular strike on their own. In the last few years, they've bombed inside Ecuador, killing not just the FARC rebels that they were going after, whom they have no right to kill, but also killing, 2 Mexican and 1 Ecuadorian students who were visiting the rebel movement's camp. So, in a third-party country, which is, but of course, this American exceptionalism, which I'm absolutely fascinating little sort of potted history you've just given. I'm very impressed by how you're able to synthesize so many of these individual events into one cohesive narrative, and you've very effectively shown the links between foreign policy and domestic policy. I was very interested in how you said the point you made about being on the same side as Moscow versus the Germans, because of sort of almost a historical accident, it created a situation where there was an opening in domestic politics. So you're actually drawing a line between the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the civil rights movements of the 60s, which of course were led often by socialists, which is something that's completely absent from the narrative. There's a narrative of emancipation, which focuses on the figures, on your Obama type figures, and says, look, there are some black people being allowed into this amazing meritocracy, which is capitalism, so that capitalism can be a non-discriminatory system. But you're saying that that's not really the case, that without a strong socialist left-wing force, the black community is much more vulnerable than it was.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. And that's why we need a re-examination of US history in the 1950s, when on the one hand, there was an official retreat from apartheid-like conditions, but on the other hand, that was accompanied by a battering of the radical movement. And what that led to was a situation where before Black people were not allowed to enter certain hotels or certain restaurants, for example. With the retreat of apartheid, you were allowed to enter these restaurants and hotels, but because of the battering of unions and the battering radical movements, what that meant is that we didn't have the income to pay the bill, which basically meant we were still not allowed to enter these restaurants and hotels.
But it was a divide and conquer tactic. It was a divide and conquer tactic used by the ruling elite to try and to disassociate the racial struggle and the class struggle.
Absolutely. It reminds me of the strategy the United States used in the genocidal war in Guatemala after the overthrow of the Arbenz regime in 1954 and the upsurge of the left in Guatemala. The US strategy was called frijoles y fusiles, beans and rifles. In other words, certain concessions accompanied by a bludgeoning of the most radical forces. And once again, you see domestic policy being replicated globally, because beans and rifles was precisely the policy that was used against the Black population of the United States. Certain concessions to woo away the Black population from its former leaders, who were mostly radicals, like Paul Robeson, for example, who was the tallest tree in our forest, and that's national symbol of resistance. He, of course, was persecuted. His passport was taken away. His income fell from the 6 figures to the low 4 figures. But at the same time, there were concessions. That is to say, a formalized retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow. And that's where we are today. I think that with the decline of the class project and the lesser amount of pressure on the US authorities, that allows them to bare their teeth. And at the same time, they feel under international pressure because there's a lot of hysteria in the United States right now about both Russia and China. That is to say that by certain measures in 2014, the Chinese economy surpassed the US economy. Now, on the one hand, you have one wing of the US ruling class that would like to get in on the gold rush in China. On the other hand, you have a wing of the US ruling class that would like to see the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party. But because they are not operating in unison, it makes them difficult to execute any kind of coherent strategy towards China. On the other hand, they are united, generally speaking, with regard to Russia. That is to say, there's no doubt that the United States would like to see regime change in Russia and complete the project of turning Russia basically into a puppet of the North Atlantic countries. Right now, that's being resisted. Interestingly enough, that also ties into US Latin American policy, because as you know, in December 2014, Washington normalized relations with Cuba. I think one of the reasons that this took place was for national security reasons. That is to say, there was a fear of a replication of the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. There was a fear that if Cuba got closer to Russia and China and remained antagonistic to the United States, Cuba could be a defensive wall against US imperialism and therefore cooperate with Beijing and Moscow if Washington was foolish and insane enough to attack Beijing and Moscow. There is a lot of concern in the US ruling class about Chinese incursions, that is to say, investment and closer relations with Caribbean nations, particularly the Bahamas, Cuba, Jamaica, Trinidad, etc. You may recall that in June 2013, right before the Sunnyland Summit between President Xi Jinping of China and Barack Obama in Sunnylands, California, President Xi Jinping met in Trinidad and Tobago with all of the Caribbean leaders. And once again, closer relations between the Caribbean nations and China ensued. And that's one of the reasons why you not only saw Barack Obama travel to Jamaica just before going to the Panama Summit that took place a few weeks ago, but also trying to normalize relations with Cuba. But at the same time, while the US administration is trying to, in a certain way, lessen tensions with certain neighbors, it's heightened tensions with Venezuela, as you may know. calling Venezuela a security threat to the United States of America, participating in an ongoing destabilization campaign against Caracas that is ongoing and accelerating as we speak.
I'd add that they also have similar there's similar attempts to destabilize the Ecuadorian government. They're less enthusiastic because it seems like a harder task, I think. But they're certainly going on, and you see, you know, the U.S. media participate in this constantly. That's obviously something I'm more conscious of. You know, and we've also seen recently the UNASUR trading bloc, the Mercosur trading bloc, this Bolivarian trading bloc. You know, what the leaders of these countries, the heads of state, were all in China just recently. And I mean, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but to what extent is America losing control in its backyard, and what will the American reaction to that be?
Well, you need to repeat that question, I'm afraid.
To what extent is the U.S. losing control in its own backyard, the quote unquote backyard, as U.S. officials like to talk about Latin America? To what extent is America really losing its veto power, its control here, and what kind of reaction can we expect?
Well, this monster is more dangerous when it feels under pressure and when it feels cornered. The problem is it's not able to strike out like it would want to in the hemisphere, but a lot of that pent-up energy is then unleashed, I'm afraid, on the Black population. For example, you mentioned Ecuador. We know that there's an ongoing problem between U.S. oil companies that despoil the environment in Ecuador, and there's ongoing litigation with regard to that, and an attempt to, in fact, intimidate and pressure U.S. nationals who are involved on the side of Ecuadorian people in trying to get compensation from these U.S. oil giants. With regard to Brazil,
I'd just like to quickly jump in there. That's the Chevron case. Yes. Chevron acquired Texaco. I like to name these people because they've named me, actually. Our organization is set up here and has contact with the Ecuadorian government and press, regulatory bodies. And so we've actually had some of our Google group discussions where we mentioned this, submitted as evidence. Of course, it's just part of what I call legal trolling, that is throwing everything they possibly can at the Ecuadorians and hoping to overwhelm them with paperwork because they can pay for more lawyers than the Ecuadorians can. The Ecuadorian villagers have one lawyer, who's himself a product of the public education system here, quite, living in very modest accommodations up against these firms, although they've got U.S. allies too. But that is very much a hot topic. But you were going to go on to Brazil, I think. There was another case.
Yeah. Well, with regard to Brazil, you know that there was these revelations about the U.S. authorities bugging the communications of President Dilma Rousseff, which led to a downturn in relations between Brasilia and Washington. Then Dilma was reelected in the latter part of 2014, but her opposition, you may have noted in the past few weeks, has been very upset with that reelection. They've been taken to the streets. And we have to be very concerned about this upsurge in the streets of Brazil, which I dare say future documents that are released will show the hand of Washington involved in this destabilization campaign against Brazil. Because as you know, Brazil has been very helpful to socialist Cuba, helping to rebuild the port of Mariel. You may recall that after the US-backed coup in Honduras in 2009, that the Brazilians refused to acknowledge the coup government, which obviously it angered and infuriated Washington. We know that in regard to Argentina, that there is an ongoing conflict between Buenos Aires and bondholders in New York who are claiming that the Argentines have not paid sufficiently these bondholders, and that's roiling relations between Argentina and the United States. There was even discussion, you may recall, a few weeks ago about President Kirchner supposedly involved in some alleged murder plot against a prosecutor concerning events that took place decades ago. So obviously, Washington faces a very unsettled hemisphere. At the same time, because the progressive movement, the radical movement, the trade union movement, the anti-racist movement is not as developed here in North America as it could be or should be. Once again, a lot of the pent-up energy and anger and fury of US imperialism is then unleashed on the traditional whipping boy. That is to say, the Black population of the United States, which once again stood against the slave owners when they revolted against British rule in 1776, stood against the apartheid Jim Crow regime that emerged in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery in 1865, and is still being punished from our antagonist point of view forevermore as a result of our temerity, as a result of our refusal to bend.
The one thing that was interesting, you mentioned these opposition movements in Brazil. Also, you could talk about here in Ecuador and Venezuela and Ukraine and Thailand and Egypt and all these various places where there will be protest movements happening in these imperial vassal states, which are counter-revolutionary, reactionary protest movements that seem normally to overturn the result of historic electoral victories of the left. And it's amazing to see the difference in the portrayal between these protesters and those people in the United States who are protesting the literal murder and impunity on the streets. And a lot of the time these protesters are seen as having less of a valid cause than people protesting in third world countries against governments where they can't often point to murder and they can't often point to this kind of overt repression. Much more minor crimes by socialist and left-leaning governments are elevated in the U.S. media, or invented in certain cases, whereas the crimes committed by the U.S. state are systematically downplayed. It's kind of an obvious point, but it's one that seems to sometimes even get lost on the left. A lot of, you see people on the left sort of much more interested in, SOS Venezuela. Well, they think they're on the left, and they're interested in SOS Venezuela and these various third world protest movements. But when there's protests in their own country, they seem to be looking for a reason to denounce and undermine them.
Well, you are correct. That reminds me of statements made by the mayor of Istanbul to the spokesman for the U.S. State Department. That is to say, the mayor of Istanbul wondered why the United States spokesman for the State Department wasn't more concerned about police brutality in Baltimore, since they seem to be concerned about police brutality in many different countries. But the dichotomy that you just sketched between certain forces of the United States saluting and celebrating certain protests and denigrating others, it stretches back to the colonial rule in North America. Interestingly enough, if you look at Bacon's rebellion in 1676 in colonial Virginia, here you had a mass upsurge against Britain and British colonists and British administrators in colonial Virginia. But why? Well, the reason was that the settlers felt that Britain wasn't moving more expeditiously and rapidly to liquidate the Native American population and oust them from their land. That's why they revolted. But you have these so-called left-wing and progressive historians who somehow twist that into this initial democratic upsurge that leads inevitably to 1776, which once again was a revolt led by slave owners and those deluded by slave owners. But because you had a certain amount of mass support for this revolt of slave owners, once again, you have left-wingers, so-called, saluting and celebrating that revolt. At the same time, with regard to socialist projects, you have the fact that their missteps and their mistakes are absolutized. That is to say, when mistakes are made in North America by the hegemonic authorities, they're relativized. That is to say, they say you have to weigh this on the scale of history. Yes, there were these eras, but on the other hand, there was this so-called positive aspect. With regard to socialist projects, there's not this relative argument. There's an absolute argument. That is to say, this mistake happened, full stop, that project was a disaster. Once again, we need a different kind of education in the United States not only in the classrooms, not only in public schools, but I'm afraid in terms of left-wing and progressive education as well.
That's something that's very interesting for me to hear, because that's always where I find myself getting most frustrated, is in conversations with other people who identify themselves as progressive. On that note, to switch to a more sort of focused look at Baltimore, I don't know if you're aware of the television writer David Simon's various comments on the incident. Now, he's a very important voice for someone like me, who everything I know about Baltimore comes from the TV show The Wire, or The Corner and Homicide, his work. And he's seen, someone described him as a translator between middle-class white America and the black underclass of the inner cities. Yet he's recently, he's made two comments which I really like your perspective on. One was that it's more about class than race, which is three actually comments. He talks about the importance of the drug war, the importance of classism, which are two points I think you probably won't, we might not have any disagreement with. But the third point was, he was talking about people, in his words, who have a brick in their hand when they go out. I don't, to me that conjures images of someone who wants to smash a store window or a cop car, or somehow otherwise damage property. And he's very condemnatory of that, as is much of the left. Personally, I'm of the perspective that if you're saying Black Lives Matter, well, how do you make that true? Well, you put a dollar price on it to the business community, and sometimes damaging property might be the only way to do that. Now, what does the history say about the success of violent or vandalism, violent protest versus non-violent protest, the role of property damage as opposed to violence against people in these uprisings? Because the one thing I think he's delusional about is the fact that if these protests were peaceful, I wouldn't have even been looking at his blog to see what he thought, because I never would have heard about them.
Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still there. Did I drop out?
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. Okay, I'll just start talking then.
Yeah.
With regard to the creator of The Wire, raising the class question in this context is very tricky, because on the one hand, we know that one of the major problems in the United States of America today is the poverty of the class analysis. We need more of a class analysis in the United States. Reference my recent comments in our conversation with regard to the class project, and how with the weakening of the class project, you've had a resurgence of racism. So I would be the first person to salute anyone who tries to make a class analysis. At the same time, sometimes those who try to make a class analysis are doing it in a way to downplay white supremacy, to downplay racism, and to portray what's happening to Black people as solely and exclusively a product of class. And that is false and should be rejected, because that does not explain what I've just enunciated and articulated, which is, why is it that a disproportionate number of people who are incarcerated and subjected to the death penalty are Black? It's not necessarily because they're workers, it's because they're Black. And so you need both a class and race and gender and a multifaceted intersectional analysis. That's point number one. Point number two, with regard to property, I think that in a time of crisis, an individual and a society reveals and exposes what they're all about. That is to say, we can see that in certain quarters, there's much more concern about property damage as opposed to human damage, particularly when the humans are Black people. That is to say, there's a lot of eagerness to push off the front pages what happened to Freddie Gray, the Black man whose spine was severed after an encounter with the police. There's an attempt to push off the front page all of the other Freddie Grays and to focus on a drugstore that was trashed for various reasons in a neighborhood in Baltimore. It was Martin Luther King Jr. himself who talked about these conflagrations. He was referring to Watts in Los Angeles in 1965 as being the voices of the unheard. And I think that's a very appropriate way in which to view this. Now, with regard to the political impact of these kinds of conflagrations, once again, I think you have to dichotomize and bifurcate the analysis. John Judis, Judis, a self-proclaimed social democratic journalist, wrote an article for the National Interest, which you can probably find online, where he argues that this focus on police brutality is alienating the Euro-American working class and middle class, and that it's turning them more to the right. At the same time, we also know that in the past, the kinds of conflagrations that you saw in the 1960s helped to illuminate reality for powerful sectors in the United States of America, leading to social concessions, leading to political and economic concessions. The question is this, that in the 1960s, there was a lot of wind at the back of our movement, in the sense that there were rising national liberation movements in Africa. There were thriving working class movements in Europe and Australia and elsewhere. There were socialist projects that were blooming and thriving. Well, we don't necessarily have that kind of wind at our back today. And that's what makes me very much concerned about the immediate future.
That's a very interesting point, because I'm always getting annoyed at this commentary. People call my generation people younger than me, especially, going even younger than I am, that we're, this apolitical generation. And I don't really buy it. I feel like this is one of the most politicized generations of young people in history, where, you can sort of you can't have a depoliticized conversation in many circles. But perhaps that context of that global context is what's different. There isn't a global left that's particularly strong. Basically, outside of Latin America, the left is in full retreat. So is that you say that makes you worry about what's going to happen in the future? Do you see an increase in repression? Is likely in the short term? You said that you think brutality is escalating. You think it's going to keep escalating under the current conditions?
I'm afraid so. And I regret having to say that. But in the short term, I think that we'll continue to have this snuff film of the week. That is to say, some poor black person being killed on tape by the authorities and then uploaded to YouTube. I think that part of the problem is that the level of organization is not as strong as it could be. I salute and celebrate the Black Lives Matter movement that's erupted in the wake of all these police killings. But what we need is an organization that has dues-paying members, that has meetings on a regular basis, that organizes demonstrations on a regular basis, that has conferences and congresses on a regular basis, that has petition campaigns, the sorts of movements that we used to have before they were all crushed as a result of these anti-Jim Crow, anti-apartheid concessions that were granted in the 1950s. Until we develop that sort of organization in league and in unison with like-minded people on the global scene, I think that until that happens, we're going to have immense difficulties right here in the belly of the beast. Speaking of which, I'm afraid I'm probably going to have to sign off sooner rather than later.
So I was about to say, I realize we've used up our time and you'll have to go. I would feel remiss, however, if I didn't make one last comment, which I've been holding on to as a sort of bookmark since earlier on. You mentioned the dislocation of indigenous communities in the United States, about how you move people from one area to another. I'm not sure if you're aware of there's a conflict happening in Australia at the moment, which is the closure of indigenous communities. So right now, we're seeing a repeat of those early, ethnic cleansing tactics of pushing people, breaking communities up, moving them from one place to another, mixing them, forcibly mixing people into a broader population to try and break up these units of resistance that you see in various communities. And this is part of a general sort of hard rightward turn in Australian politics, which has, its analogs elsewhere in the world. Where that's just one more horror story, and there's no shortage of them. And this is the question I asked the last person I interviewed, who is an organizer in Kentucky, a local organization, not something national. Is what hope is there somehow bringing these various causes together? Because at the moment, it seems to me like they're often actually sort of competing with each other for attention, each trying to get the attention of the mainstream media, which ties back to the sort of theatrical nature of nonviolent movements as well, their need for eyeballs. Where do you see hope going forward for unifying these various causes?
Well, first of all, with regard to your first movement, let me reiterate what I said a few moments ago, which is that in my book, The White Pacific, I deal quite a bit with the struggles of indigenous people in that part of the world, not only in Fiji and in Hawaii, but also the Maori resistance in New Zealand and the resistance of the indigenous people of Australia. Second of all, with regard to your second point, I think obviously we need the coming together of these disparate movements, the movements against free trade, for example, the movement against police brutality, the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's movement, the union movement, and ultimately, somewhere down the road, we need to have these movements congeal into a political force that challenges for state power, that tries to destabilize the duopoly, where you have these two parties of big business, the Republican Party, which is basically an alliance between business and the white middle class and the white working class. It's sort of the white United Front Party. And then the Democrats, which is an alliance between big business and a multiracial labor force, multiracial working class, and a multiracial middle class. Now, in order for those two wings of the working class to come together, obviously we need mass education within the Euro-American community, because right now, 60% of that community is voting for the right. You may recall that in 1991, just as the socialist camp was imploding, you saw in the state of Louisiana that about 55 to 60% of those defined as white in Louisiana voted for a leader of the Nazi Party to be governor. And but for a massive turnout of Black voters, you would have had a Nazi governor of Louisiana in 1991. I think that should have been a wake-up call, because it could be a harbinger of what we will be facing somewhere down the road unless we get better organized, unless we get more militant, unless, I dare say, we become more revolutionary.
Fuck yeah, is all I can say to that. If you'll pardon the language, I would love to. I'm going to let you go and dedicate more time to your students on that front. Although I hope we have you back to talk more about these issues. Particularly, I'm curious. I'd love to continue the conversation about what the left's doing wrong and what we could do better. We can leave that for another time, though. Thank you so much, Professor Gerald Horne from Houston University. Thanks for joining us on Important Call.
Thank you for inviting me. Good luck.
See you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.